Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the 120 podcast, where we're going to discuss sepsis, disability, and chronic illness. Those of you who know have been watching the episodes. My name is Jackie Duda. I live in Central Maryland. I am a septic shock survivor. I also have chronic conditions, including but not limited to Crohn's disease, POTS, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and severe osteoporosis. After surviving septic shock 4 years ago, after being flown to shock trauma in Baltimore because I had a colon perforation from undiagnosed diverticulitis, and it quickly led to septic shock, and I nearly died. After all that, and after about 2 years of working towards getting stronger, I became an advocate, a very outspoken advocate for those of you who know me well. And that's why I have a podcast here too, because I love to talk and I love to advocate. So I became a sepsis and disability awareness advocate. And I developed this podcast to give rise to all of our voices when it comes to sepsis, and that includes and disability and chronic illness. So that includes people with disabilities, people with chronic conditions. And by the way, did you know that we're more susceptible to sepsis? Anyway, so you see the connection there, right? So I developed this podcast to give rise to all of our voices, the voices of survivors, the voices of families who have been affected by sepsis, who've tragically lost somebody to sepsis, national nonprofits to give rise to the voices of the scientists, the doctors, and the researchers behind sepsis, behind rare diseases, behind disabilities. So anyway, today I'm really excited because I'm going to have a researcher on, a scientist who has worked as a vaccinologist. And those of you who know, a vaccinologist is a scientist who works with vaccines and the development of vaccines that help prevent or reduce the effects and impacts of infectious diseases and other conditions. So I'm excited to have Robert Donald on today. He is a researcher with decades, over 4 decades of experience, education and experience working in the scientific field of vaccine development and research, and also something called AMR, antimicrobial resistance. Now, what does this have to do with sepsis? Well, part of it is that sepsis cannot develop without an infection, right? So you have to have an infection for sepsis to even be able to develop. Vaccines help prevent certain infections. So vaccines are important as part of our arsenal, so to speak, when it comes to infection prevention measures. So I'm going to have Robert on today. He's an advisory board member on Sepsis Alliance's advisory board with me, and that's how I got to meet him, actually. So I'm very lucky to be able to meet the doctors and the scientists that I do. And I wanted to get the lowdown on vaccines because I was never a science major in college. I was actually an English major, which is why I write and talk a lot. But I was always interested in science. I was always a little nerdy about science, and 2 of my children actually majored in science, one in biology and one in chemistry. So I've been exposed to it quite a bit over the years, and always wanting to know the why when it comes to science. And so I invited Robert on today. He's a research microbiologist with broad experience in the biology of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And don't worry, guys, we're going to break this all down for you, okay? And if you have questions, please put them in the comments section below. Anyway, Robert earned his doctorate degree at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and he did postdoctoral research. So he went to school even more at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Pennsylvania. His research career has been dedicated to developing new antimicrobial drugs and vaccines that prevent life-threatening infections. At Merck and Company, he contributed to drug discovery programs aimed at identifying new antibiotics to prevent bacterial, fungal, and parasitic infections. And more recently, when he worked at Pfizer, he led early-stage vaccine development programs, advancing vaccines to prevent a variety of different bacterial infections. Now, guys, I know that's a lot, but that's what it is with science and research. It takes years, it takes a lot of study, it takes a lot of clinical trials, it takes a lot of assessments when it comes to what are we going to be, how are we going to develop these therapies for patients, and are they safe for patients? So a lot of the, when it came to him advancing these vaccines to prevent a variety of different bacterial infections, now I know some of you might recognize these names, they're quite common. Some of those bacterial infections include E. coli, C. diff, Enterococcus, and Group B Streptococcus bacteria. Strep. How many of us have had strep throat? All right. Are you familiar? It's nasty. It's a horrible, horrible infection. Robert also has managed molecular biology and immunology assay teams supporting these programs, as well as Pfizer's successful RSV and COVID-19 vaccine programs. Now, he's retired from commercial research and development. He's seeking to apply his previous experience to advising and educating. In addition to serving on the Sepsis Alliance Advisory Board, he's also a consultant to CARB-X, which is a global nonprofit partnership focused on supporting the development of new therapies and vaccines to address antimicrobial drug resistance. And I'm actually going to have Robert on for a second episode in a little while to talk about what that is, antimicrobial drug resistance. If you think you know what that is, tell me in the comments. Anyway, and believe it or not, this busy scientist also has time for a personal life. In his personal life, he is also a husband and father of 2 children who are now adults. In his free time, he enjoys walking his dog and doing yoga and swimming. I just want to add a special note to all of these podcasts. Remember, I just want to remind viewers that this podcast is not intended to be medical advice. If you have an infection or another medical issue, please contact your own physician or go straight to your local emergency room. So we are not medical advice here. We are here for informational purposes only. Anyway, without further ado, I would like to welcome Robert to the podcast. I've been excited to talk about vaccines with him for a very long time, and I hope that it helps some of you also learn about vaccines and our immune system and the development of vaccines, and basically a little peek behind the curtain as to how that all works. Anyway, thank you, Robert. Thank you for everything, for making the time to come on the podcast with me today. I really appreciate your time. And welcome again, audience, for being here again for another episode. So I'm really excited to have Robert Donald on today. We're going to talk vaccines. We're going to get, down to the nitty gritty in a very simple way and just help all of us understand why these vaccines are so important and what they are. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today. And I want to go ahead and dig right in and get started with the origin of the problem, why we have to have vaccines in the first place. There's, viruses, bacteria. Can you help our audience understand how long those have been around and what really they are?
Sure. So start with bacteria first. Bacteria are some of the first forms of life on this planet, and they appeared, according to the fossil record, 3.5 billion years ago. And the fossil record shows that, from the so-called stromalite fossils, these are kind of mats of bacteria that were recognizable and traceable in terms of time. To put that in context, we humans have only been on the planet for 300,000 years, so there's a huge gap. So I think it's important to remind folks that actually most bacteria are good. They're not bad at all. We'll get into the details of the bad bacteria, the pathogenic, so-called pathogenic bad bacteria. But bacteria are single-celled organisms. They're way smaller than human cells, about tenfold smaller. And they drastically, in those early times, changed the Earth's atmosphere because they generated oxygen. The so-called cyanobacteria, which are the progenitors of our plants, they produced oxygen as a byproduct of energy production. And they are the ancestors of modern plants. And of course, bacteria back in those days were also the ancestors of multicellular animals, ultimately like us. So most are good, and the role of bacteria in our environment, in the soil and around us, is generally essential for breaking down decaying matter, recycling nutrients in the soil, and doing things like, taking nitrogen from the air and converting it into a usable source, like ammonia for plants. And the examples there are, most of you are familiar with leguminous plants, peas, beans, clover, and this is a way of ensuring good nutrient turnover in your garden. There's a fun fact that you'll be aware of, some of you will be aware of, that there are actually more bacteria living on you or inside you than there are human cells in your body. And these are mostly in your gut. And what do they do there? They help us digest our food, to absorb our nutrients. They create an environment that inhibits the growth of bad bacteria. And it's important to maintain a balance between good and bad bacteria. And so the other place where you have a lot of bacteria is on your skin. So, for example, an overgrowth of bad bacteria, which one example is Staphylococcus aureus, it can lead to skin lesions, eczema, and infections. But if you have, your other bacteria around, that can help prevent those infections from occurring. Finally, I should also mention we may or may not get into fungi, but that's another simple, originally single-celled organism. Also very good at times. We've got baker's yeast, but they can also cause bad infections, especially in the immunocompromised. And we often associate fungi with mold, like bread mold. But here too, they can be associated with good, but on the other side, they can also cause disease. I think one thing that's also important to bring up, we're talking mainly about vaccines today, but actually our antibiotics that were developed before the Second World War, penicillin being the first one, came actually from a mold, and then other antibiotics came from soil bacteria like streptomycin, and so this is why good bacteria are so important as natural products. The antibiotics that they make are part of the biowarfare that occurs in the soil. These bacteria and fungi need to compete in their environment for the other microbes around, and so they make these compounds or antibiotics to kill off the competition, to allow them to grow. And we, as scientists back in the day, have exploited that. And in this day and age, medicinal chemists take these natural products and tinker with them to make them more effective, to make them work better in your body. So that's the good stuff. With the viruses, viruses, of course, is another important topic. They can be pathogenic. They're usually pathogenic, meaning they cause disease. But they've been around also since the beginning of time, because bacteria have viruses that invade and replicate inside them, just as we do with our human cells. So the difference between a virus and a bacterium is that viruses cannot grow or replicate outside of a cell. And viruses tend to be very specific for the cell type. There are viruses that infect particular E. coli strains. There are viruses that affect our respiratory system. We're going to talk more about those, such as the flu virus, RSV, and COVID. But again, they're simpler. They grow only inside of cells. So they tend to be, with their less complex biologies, often easier to combat with vaccines than some of the bacterial pathogens, which have all kinds of immune evasion mechanisms, and because they're more complicated, they can often be harder to treat than viruses. Although some viruses are also hard to treat, such as herpes viruses in particular. So that's kind of an introduction then to the biology of what we're talking about. Yeah, I think that wraps that segment up. Anything
Yes.
else?
Oh, very nicely, Robert. Thank you. And so bacteria are basically a very simple thing, a one-celled organism, right?
Right.
But they have a job to do as well. See, I didn't realize, I know what bacteria are and I knew what viruses are, but I didn't realize that they were conducive to, say, like, did you say they help put oxygen back into our atmosphere?
Well,
like the
they did back in
predecessor,
the early times, right?
right, the predecessor to like plants like
Yeah,
these, like this plant behind
exactly.
me. So before the plants came the bacteria, which help supply oxygen to the atmosphere. That's an
Correct.
interesting little factoid. I didn't know that.
Mhm.
So they do have a job to do there, and they aren't just bad. We do have, as you said, we have more good bacteria making up our bodies than we have human cells. Did I hear that correct?
Yes, yes, especially in the gut, where there are pounds of bacteria in our guts.
Right. And that, yes, and the gut can be the boss sometimes. So it helps everything else work. If the gut's working well, everything else works well. And I think that's why a lot of people like to eat those yogurts with probiotics in them because those,
Okay.
I'll even joke when I go to the grocery store and I'll pick up some yogurt and I look at the bacteria content and say, yep, I'm getting my healthy dose of bacteria today because the bad bacteria almost killed me 4 years ago when it got into my abdomen when my colon perforated.
Exactly. And yeah, so I mean, the bacteria are in the gut, the good bacteria in the gut are also susceptible to the broad spectrum antibiotics that we are sometimes given, for example, in response to sepsis. And so this is kind of a good segue into the sepsis topic. Antibiotics will wipe out a lot of the good bacteria in your gut. In some cases, it can make you more susceptible to pathogens like Clostridium difficile, which is a devastating pathogen, particularly in the elderly, that causes your guts to perforate, and then you get an E. coli infection that then takes off. Or Crohn's disease is another case where E. coli bacteria, when the gut is damaged, can exploit and then break through and invade the rest of your body.
And that's
As
what we call C. diff, right?
C. diff, yeah,
A lot of our
Clostridioides
listeners
difficile
will
or
know probably by
Clostridium.
C. diff. A lot of people
Yeah,
know what that
exactly.
means.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And then with
So
sepsis, we also have the classic sepsis bacteria, which, takes advantage of gut issues and perforations, is E. coli. And in the elderly, E. coli is the major cause of sepsis through urinary tract infections, right? So you get,
right.
particularly women are more susceptible to urinary tract infections because the plumbing is a little bit different, shorter urethra compared to men. And in the frail elderly, urinary tract infections can often lead to urinary tract infections that start in the bladder and then go up into the kidney, and then you can have infections that end up with bacteria in the blood, which is the sepsis, where you end up having dysregulation of your immune system, and you can go into shock without treating the immune dysfunction, but you also need the antibiotics to knock back the bacteria.
Right. It's sort of like if you think about it like a scale, we have to have a certain balance of, good bacteria and, to overtake the bad bacteria when they're called upon. They're sort of like an army in there.
That's right, and that's a perfect analogy because that vaccines work that way too. The concept of natural immunity versus vaccine immunity. So natural immunity is when your body can handle the infection itself because it's been exposed typically to that pathogen before. And so your immune system learns to recognize over repeated exposure. And what vaccines do is it tips the balance in favor of the immune system quickly taking out um, a pathogen or a bacterium or a virus that maybe it hasn't seen before. So with COVID, the reason COVID was so devastating, COVID-19 disease and the underlying virus, so-called SARS-CoV-2, was so devastating because it was a very hypervirulent new strain, and for most folks, the immune system was not able to control the infection, and so if you had vulnerabilities, you were frail, elderly, immune system not robust. It could quickly result in very severe lung damage, damage to your vascular system, and that's where we had a lot of deaths. But with the advent of vaccines, we're able to knock that back, not to prevent transmission. We did learn over the course of the pandemic and subsequently the vaccines are not 100% effective, certainly not 100% effective in preventing transmission, but they keep you out of the hospital. They keep you from getting really sick. Same with flu virus vaccines, and much the same with the newer RSV vaccines. RSV is a respiratory syncytial virus, is a mouthful, but it's a pathogen that afflicts the young, but also the elderly, and that's another thing that is clear. We are most at risk when we're infants, because our immune systems aren't mature. But also as we age, our immune systems degrade, and we're not as capable of fighting off infections as we are as teenagers and younger adults.
And I think too that the way I understand it with vaccines is it does help us to keep the horse in the barn, so to speak. You don't want the whole herd getting out, stampeding, because these viruses can quickly overtake. Like we saw in, 1918, we had the flu that overtook, and it actually took younger people back then. So
Yep.
it was kind of in
Soldiers a lot. Yeah.
yes, it was the reverse of what COVID-19 became, but it was rampant, and they didn't have vaccines then. So a lot of young people died. I mean, I forget, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but there were a lot of deaths in years like 1918 to all up until 1921, was it, Robert? Do you know?
Yeah, it was certainly around the First World War because it impacted First World War campaigns in Europe. It affected killed a lot of soldiers.
Right. And so that's the way I see it is, getting my vaccines keeps me out of the hospital. And, I've had, we were talking before I started to record today, about, of course, about that shingles vaccine. And I had shingles actually about 15 years ago, might have even been 20 years ago. And I had shingles, and they were horrible. And I was really sick, and the treatments are very strong, impact the nervous system. It disoriented me, and the pain was exquisite. It was horrible. So my husband and I went to get our shingles vaccines earlier this year. We got the first one back in, I believe it was June, and he was fine. He went out and cut the grass. We got them on a Friday. Saturday, he's out there cutting grass, and I'm laying in bed going, why do I feel like I have the flu? And especially because I don't have reactions to the other vaccines. I don't react to the flu vaccine or the COVID vaccine. I get a little tired. That's about it.
Mhm.
Like I might take an extra nap that day. But that shingles vaccine, wow, that set me back for a few days. But it was still better than having shingles, because that problem and that pain lasted for months.
Yeah, no, that's right. The shingles vaccine, which I had, I remember the first dose hit me hard, and I think the reason for that is that the shingles vaccine, and the modern shingles vaccine, which is an improvement over the previous one, which was a live attenuated so-called zoster vaccine made by Merck, was not as effective and had um, the effect was quite poor actually. And then the newer vaccine is a very simple vaccine. It's a single viral protein of the chickenpox virus, the variola virus, and it has also it's formulated with what's called an adjuvant, which is an immune system irritant. Um, uh, which is a little harsh. It consists of a detergent called a saponin mixed with a compound that is there to stimulate your immune system to recognize bacteria. Well, it's a response that primes your immune system in general. Formulated with lipid as well, and this adjuvant, I think, may be why it's a little harsher than some of the other vaccines that we take. But I think the other thing to compare the difference between you and your husband and me with the first and second doses is I think we're all different. Genetically, we have to realize that our responses to drugs, our responses to vaccine, is in part due to differences in our genetic makeup, predispositions to um, autoimmune disease can vary according, there are genetic components to that. And yeah, we can't expect to, behave necessarily similarly. I think the other thing that one has observed with the COVID vaccine, having, worked formerly at Pfizer, is that I noticed among the lab workers that I used to work with, the younger folks had more um, adverse reactions, meaning we're talking local injection site, minor redness and maybe not feeling great. Um, Whereas the old guys and gals tended to have fewer side effects. And part of that is, again, when you're young and if you're in your 20s, 30s, your immune system is robust. It's very strong. And so you respond to the vaccine. And in the case of the COVID vaccine, it has it's a lipid nanoparticle with the RNA inside, and that stimulates your immune system in an so-called adjuvanting kind of way.
Yeah, lipid, that makes me think of lipid tests that I have done to check my cholesterol. And lipid's a protein, right?
Lipids are fats, so
Fats, yes, that's it.
the lipids are used to encapsulate, like in a little ball, so that lipid nanoparticles, which contain the vaccine components, the RNA or whatever else, are rapidly taken up by cells because cells have lipids as well. So cells have a fatty uh, outer membrane that when it comes in contact with a micelle, it can dissolve into the cell more readily and move around your body more readily. It's a more efficient way of delivering vaccines, and it's not just genetic vaccines like RNA and DNA vaccines, but also there, as I mentioned, the adjuvant that's used for Shingrix or shingles vaccine is also a lipid, micelle has lipid particles.
Yes, and I'm sorry, Robert, I'm getting ahead of us because we do want to talk a little bit more about the vaccines themselves. But it just prompted me to think about that reaction because I'm recently undergoing this series of vaccines with the shingles vaccine. But the thing is too, I think we're going to get into a little bit shift into the immune system itself. And when you're pregnant women especially, our immune systems dial it back a little bit, don't they? Like our immune systems are decreased, our responses might be decreased when we're pregnant.
Ah, yes, that's actually an interesting topic. Yeah, I'm not a physician. I'm not an
Right.
expert in the
Yes.
immunology that occurs around pregnancy. Although, as a vaccinologist, I know that pregnancy is actually a really great time for intervening with vaccines, and we can talk about this, but a lot of it has to do with protecting the newborn as well as the mother from invasive disease because the newborns, where do they get their antibodies from? Antibodies are part of the proteins of your immune system that recognize and bind to the viruses or the bacterium. And then in conjunction with other immune system proteins like so-called complement, work together with immune cells like B cells, T cells to destroy the pathogen. But the antibodies are key, and you get the antibodies through your mother's placenta as a newborn. You get them through the mother's milk, which is why breastfeeding is important. And so for the first few weeks and months of life, the baby is vulnerable unless it gets those antibodies from the mother. And if the mother doesn't have antibodies against those pathogens through natural immunity or from vaccination, one way of getting it to the baby, there's a maternal RSV vaccine, for example, that is now available to protect the infant, but also the mother during pregnancy. There's a Group B Streptococcus vaccine, which is now in phase 3, which will protect against the main cause of sepsis in newborns is from Group B Streptococcus, to some extent from E. coli as well. So in other words, interventions during pregnancy, including, for example, the flu vaccine. You don't want a flu infection while you're pregnant because that alone can cause birth defects. If you get a very bad case, it can cause consequences to the developing fetus. And then of course the other vaccine, which is often given during pregnancy, is the so-called Tdap for tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, which is whooping cough. The vaccine can protect the mother as well as the infant. Although that vaccine is also given as a standard course according to the schedule recommended by the CDC for infants and babies.
Right, right. And it because it makes me think of my own experience with pregnancy and illness was when my daughter was in kindergarten. She got chickenpox. This was back in early 1990 because my son was born in March 1990, and I had never had chickenpox before. I came a long time after my older siblings. There was like 15, 12-year gap. So, and they were born in the 40s, in the 50s. So they had to endure a lot of these diseases and had some problems from that as well. So I come along 1962, and then my mom was able to get me like the MMR vaccines and all that, but we didn't have a chickenpox vaccine back then, and I never happened to get it, but I got it when I was 7 months pregnant. Got it for my daughter, and there I was miserable. I was the sickest I had ever remembered being, and we were so scared and worried because, of course, our whole thought was asking our doctor, "What's this going to do to the baby? What's going to happen?" And so their main, there was comfort care. The doctor actually was able to come to my house back then because no way was I allowed to go in the office. And, he took care of me that way. And it was basically a lot of bed rest. Well, there was nothing else I really felt or had the energy to do. I was itching horribly, and everything. So the doctor just said, "We're just going to hope the baby doesn't come early," because if he had been born while I was still infected with chickenpox, he said there was something like a 40-50% mortality rate for the infant.
Yeah.
So that scared the life out of us. And we were just hoping, just don't come early and everything. And he was born on time, actually a little bit late. And then when he was a few years old, the chickenpox vaccine was coming out, or he might have been closer to 6. I had the doctor test his antibodies. I said, just see if he had them, because I had them when I was pregnant. He didn't have any antibodies. I marched him straight off for that chickenpox vaccine. When I had my 2 younger daughters, they got that chickenpox vaccine because it was horrible. It was horrible. And, my OB back then said, "Yeah, you got it. Basically, your immune system isn't as robust when you're pregnant because it tries to protect the baby, the body, from seeing it as a foreign invader. And, and you got the chickenpox." So, and it was terrible. That was, again, it was my personal experience because I'm 63 years old now. And I remember I live on the precipice of a time before we had many of the vaccines we have today, but I was lucky enough to be born when some of the really heavy hitters were coming out, and measles was bad. Measles was horrible.
Well, measles is bad. Rubella, which is German measles, is even worse when you're pregnant because it causes birth defects and miscarriages. The last outbreak was in 1964, 1965. About 12 million people got rubella. 11,000 pregnant women lost their babies due to miscarriages.
My
2,000 newborn.
mother-in-law was one of them.
Yeah, and so that is the value of the MMR vaccine. It covers measles, mumps, and rubella, which is German measles. And the vaccine is a so-called live attenuated vaccine. It's very effective. When 95% of the population gets vaccinated as kids, as part of the normal vaccine schedule, you have herd immunity. You've heard with the measles outbreaks in Texas recently, that's when herd immunity breaks down, when
Yes.
not enough people get vaccinated in a community, you have these outbreaks that come. And measles is particularly bad because recent research has shown that measles virus actually attacks your memory B cells. These are the cells that make your antibodies that protect you against other infections as well. So your kids are going to be more susceptible to additional infections if they get the measles.
Right,
And
because the
measles,
measles can attack that part of, like, the part of your body's own natural ability to make
that's
antibodies.
right. It prevents you from responding to other infections. Um, and measles, as you probably have heard, is one of the most infectious viruses out there. It spreads very, very rapidly, even more than COVID, which is adapted to be more infectious over time.
And it kind of hangs out like in the atmosphere, even like if an infected person's been in a room and they leave that room, you can go in that room right after them and still possibly catch measles, right?
That's right.
So yeah, that's very, very catchy. And again, I'll pass. I don't want that. And we're sort of getting into that topic of, how our immune systems work. And also I think it's in talking about that, we're also going to be able to sort of dance between that topic and also the topic of what these diseases are that have actually been eradicated by the vaccines, and talking about herd immunity and all of that. So we have these immune systems, as you had explained. So they form antibodies, right? There are body's defense system. They see invaders to go after.
Yeah, so the immune system is a complex network of not just cells, but also organs and, of course, proteins, which includes antibodies that work together to protect against bacteria, viruses, and parasites. So the cells that are involved are the so-called memory B cells that make your antibodies, which are the proteins that recognize, that bind to the pathogen, and in concert with other immune cells, which are so-called neutrophils and macrophages. These are white blood cells, gobble up like Pac-Man. They together with the antibodies that bind to the bug, they can then attack and clear and remove the bacteria and the viruses. We also, as part of our immune system, have the bone marrow, the spleen, the lymph nodes, and the thymus. These are immune organs that generate um, our immune cells,
The
white blood
thymus
cells.
is up here, right?
Yeah.
By the thyroid, or it's not part of the thyroid gland,
No,
is
no,
it?
that's you got your parathyroid, your thyroid,
Yes.
and the thymus is
And
elsewhere up there
okay,
somewhere.
yes. And all of this is all involved in this intricate manufacturing of, for a more simplistic term, the way I think of it is, and you described it well, the Pac-Man, the little
Yeah.
Pac-Man gobbling up the bad invaders, the bad things trying to get into our bodies.
And
So,
so, yes, in the simplest form, it's really the antibodies are key that recognize and bind to the pathogen, bacteria
mhm.
or virus, but then it's also the white blood cells, the so-called neutrophils, and we've also got what are called T cells. This is a much more complex part of immune protection, which involves presenting parts of the bug, the so-called antigens, in a way that uh, allows for what's called cell-mediated immunity as opposed to antibody immunity. So the white blood cells are trained then to engulf the pathogens, and actually the host cells that contain the pathogens. So it's a more complex and different immune evasion technique, but it's important for, in particular, intracellular pathogens. Those are pathogens that grow inside of our cells. So for things like chlamydia, that's a sexually transmitted disease, viruses like COVID, and flu that actually enter cells, you have not just an antibody immunity, but you also have a so-called T cell component to immunity that's important for clearing those infections as well. Bacteria, for the most part, are mopped up quickly by antibodies and by neutrophils and another protein in your immune protein in your blood called complement, which allow the neutrophils to gobble them up and clear out the disease.
That's why some of my because I have, as you know, several autoimmune diseases, and sometimes in my lab work, I'll see C complement ordered as something that they're looking at, or
Yeah.
other complements. And that's part of that, because when you have an autoimmune disease, your immune system is it's attacking organs in your own body.
Right. If you have a complement to genetic disease or
Mhm.
defect, you won't be able to fight the pathogen as well. And it's a rare thing, but it does happen, and those patients are particularly susceptible to infections of all kinds. Yeah.
Now, something really interesting, you called them memory B cells.
Yeah, those are the white blood cells that, upon re-exposure of to a vaccine antigen, which is part of the bug or the bug itself through natural invasion, um, the B cell is is basically a little factory that makes a lot of one antibody. It's a so-called clone. And as your immune system responds to an infection or repeated infections or a vaccine and repeated doses of a vaccine, the memory B cells are primed so that next time the body encounters the bug, it pumps out a lot of antibodies. So you have an antibody concentration in the blood. It's called a titer, which you measure. And when you
Yes.
take blood tests, there are titers which are measured with certain assays or tests. And following the level of antibodies to the pathogen is one way of seeing if your body is sufficiently primed to protect against the disease.
It sounds logical to me to call it a memory B cell, because it
Hmm.
sounds like what you're describing is it remembers
Hmm.
the infection, and it's like, hey, I recognize you. No, you're going to be gone. You're out of here. And perhaps that might be what happened with my body with the shingles vaccine, because my husband had never had shingles before, but I had. And so the way I explained it to people when they were like, oh my God, you got really sick from it. I said, yeah, I think my body it saw it, it recognized it, and it said, no way, you're not, turn up the heat, give her a fever, do all of this stuff to help fight it. But memory B cells, that's something really interesting, I think, and a very simple name for it, because they do remember, especially those repeated infections. And you mentioned about the white cells too. White cells fighting off these organisms, in the bad organisms. Is that why when they suspect sepsis, they'll check our blood work to look at our white cell count?
Right.
Because mine was sky high, like
Yeah.
in the tens of thousands.
Right. When you have a high white blood cell count, it generally reflects a raging and acute infection. And the white blood cells there are a whole many different types of white blood cells. There are white blood cells that are I don't want to get too much into terminology, but there's a so-called innate immunity, which is the white blood cells will non-specifically recognize a virus or a bacterium and mop it up and kill it. But there's also from natural immunity or from vaccines a so-called adaptive response, meaning the white blood cells are able to recognize and amplify and respond to, first of all, the natural infection, but or the vaccine or additional doses of the vaccine. So it's a much more rapid way of and specific way of targeting the virus or the pathogen than the innate response. The innate response is often not enough when you have, as we talked about earlier, a pathogen that is super virulent. I mean, super aggressive. Virulence just means the ability to move quickly and invade because of the particular pathogen proteins or properties of the pathogen, such as the SARS-CoV-2, which came very out of almost nowhere and was super aggressive in terms of killing those that were at risk.
Right, right. So that's why I think, our audience can always remember that too, in terms of sepsis is one of the lab tests that they may do on you or a family member, is to check those white blood cell counts to
Mhm.
see if they're very high, which would indicate that your body is fighting an infection. Now, and it sounds like between these B cells and our T cells, and all these wonderful cells that make up part of our immune system, it sounds like we have this really efficient, you know, disease fighting engine right inside of us. And I like the term that you used about mopping up the mess after they devour or destroy the organisms. That's a great way to put it, I think, you know, just to kind of mop them up and clean it up. So if we have this little factory of a disease fighting factory inside of us, why isn't like why is natural immunity more of a risky gamble? Why, you know, why isn't it enough to keep us well and to keep us, you know, why did some people succumb to COVID? Why, you know, why did some people succumb to smallpox? And this is where I think we're going to dovetail very nicely into the next issue of what kind of diseases have been eradicated when we were only relying when we got vaccines because relying on our own immune system wasn't working. And I'm sorry if that was a very lengthy question, but I'm
No,
trying to kind of parse this out in my brain too.
yeah, no, we touched on this earlier, but very aggressive strains of bacteria and viruses, they can so quickly overwhelm our immune system if we've not experienced them before. So what vaccines do much more efficiently is if you haven't seen a SARS-CoV-2 virus before, ever, you're going to be at risk if your immune system isn't already primed, and that's where vaccines will teach your immune system to be ready by priming the memory B cells so that they will pump out antibodies that will bind to the virus, neutralize it, prevent it from binding to that host cell receptor, which is present in cells in your lungs or in your vascular system, and block the ability of the virus to get into your cells and replicate. Natural immunity is great. In fact, the best thing of all is if you have natural immunity and a vaccine, because the vaccine only targets one protein that's on the surface of the virus. Natural immunity, your immune system will see everything. A natural infection will take a virus, for example, SARS-CoV-2, break it down, and all of the proteins that are exposed will be recognized by B cell antibodies, and so you'll have a more comprehensive and broader immune response when you have a combination of natural immunity and the vaccine, which is very specific to just the receptor binding interaction and the antibodies that can then block the binding of the spike protein is what it's called, but the binding of the
Yeah, that
virus.
little round, spiky looking thing that they use to show us what the COVID um, virus looked like.
Yeah, so natural immunity is wonderful, but there's certain aggressive pathogens. You mentioned smallpox. I
Yes.
mean, smallpox, if you've not seen it or haven't been vaccinated, it kills 1 in 4 people. It's very, very aggressive.
And
And we
it's a
basically
horrible
eradicated,
disease.
smallpox has been eradicated through vaccines, essentially. I think there's some smallpox um, strains in freezers in Russia and maybe at the CDC, but by and large, the vaccines were able to eradicate it. Uh, and it's not an issue, although it's a potential biowarfare agent, right? If you don't have people vaccinated, smallpox can be pretty aggressive and dangerous.
That was the vaccine I got. I remember it left a little, I still have it, a little white scar on my shoulder. That was a large, it felt like a very large type of vaccine and because it actually caused you to scab over, like you developed a scab after getting the smallpox vaccine back then.
It might have been the BCG vaccine, which is a tuberculosis vaccine. I remember I
Okay.
got the BCG, which is it's a strain of Mycobacterium, which is not pathogenic, but it provides some protection in infants anyway against respiratory tuberculosis.
Okay.
It's not used much anymore, but I remember it gave me a little scar. Smallpox, if you got it, that's great, but I'm not sure that by the time we're the
Um,
same. Actually, I'm a little bit older than you, so I'm not sure. I grew up in the UK, so I'm not sure what was approved and used with
we
school
used to
children.
get them in school, actually. We used to get our vaccines in school. The school nurse came around and, she gave you the vaccines
Yeah,
and
I
away you
got
went.
mine at school. Yeah,
Um, but yeah, so we do have these great immune systems and they do work well. However, what I think, and it's nice that we've forgotten vaccines actually work so well that we've forgotten what it was like to have tuberculosis wards, to have people in clinics lined up in iron lungs from polio.
right.
We don't, a lot of us living today haven't seen that. We haven't, we don't remember that. My grandparents always did. And that's where I learned about these diseases actually, because the concern over the spread of disease at the time when I was a very little girl was a big concern. It was a huge concern, and my mom was fastidious about hygiene, hand washing, brush your teeth, keep yourself clean, because she grew up in a time, she was born in 1921. So she grew up in a time where these diseases were running rampant. And she remembered and she told me about it. But we don't remember because the vaccines wiped these out, a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean that's the proof in the pudding that vaccines are effective when you don't have outbreaks and deaths from vaccine preventable illnesses, of which there are many. And we hit on this a little bit earlier, the so-called Tdap vaccine against tetanus, pertussis, and mumps, and then also the chickenpox vaccine. Um, those diseases have been largely controlled. And then we have the MMR vaccine, where we have again we had herd immunity for measles, but it does pop up from time to time. Whooping cough is was largely stamped out, but it's coming back in populations where the herd immunity doesn't offer sufficient protection. The cases of pertussis, which is whooping cough, and measles have skyrocketed in this last year, and there's concern about, um, you know, vaccine hesitancy among parents, in part because of the chaos that is going on at the moment in our U.S. government, U.S. governmental control of human health and services and so on. We don't need to go there, but
Yes, I know. I hear you totally. My mother would talk sometimes, and my grandmother, her mother would talk about hearing a baby with whooping cough and knowing parents who lost their children, hearing a baby with whooping cough. My mother said she couldn't unhear it, that infant would cough constantly, could not catch their breath, could not, and it was horrible. And my mother also had to go, she went to a funeral for a neighbor who lost I think he was either 2 or 3 to polio. And she said it was horrific. She says she couldn't get the image of a baby in a coffin out of her brain. And then mumps also at the time, the MMR vaccine for our listening audiences, measles, mumps, and rubella, the German measles. And mumps also caused some men to be sterile, didn't it? Because of the
yeah, I
swelling.
think so. Yes.
So these were not, these weren't minor illnesses by a long shot. They were very serious and they caused a lot of people to die. And there's still a baby land in an old cemetery back home where I'm from in Southwest PA, and it's called Babyland because so many babies died back then. That's why some people had 10 kids, because you were lucky if 2 survived, because the rest would, lose their lives to many of these illnesses. The illnesses we don't remember anymore because the vaccines have helped control or wipe them out. And so that's, Is that like the main purpose of when was the first vaccine developed and why?
Yes, so the first vaccine that was developed, and some of you may remember from high school, was the smallpox vaccine. Edward Jenner was the English physician who developed the first successful vaccine. And the vaccine that he developed was it was from was from a related virus, which was cowpox. Cowpox, smallpox. Smallpox is specific for humans. Cowpox was causing disease in cows, I think specifically the udders of the cows. And what he found is because they're close enough related, he found that a cowpox blister could be used, I mean, a liquid from a blister from the cow could be used as a vaccine to prevent human smallpox disease. And so this occurred back in 1850s. And that was the origin of some of the first anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitancy because there was a vaccination act that required mandatory vaccination for infants up to, I think, 3 months old, and extending it later to older ages. And there was immediate resistance from citizens who demanded the right to control their own bodies and their children, which is understandable, which is, we've had this recently with COVID, right? No one wants to be told to get vaccinated under certain circumstances like COVID-19, a disease. When you're in the middle of a pandemic and you've got to protect patients in the hospital, I think there's some reason to justify mandatory vaccinations for the hospital staff. I think the possible mistake that was made was fairly heavy-handed at the time, was to insist that everyone would be required to get vaccinated. And of course, people don't like that. So like masking children, which was hugely controversial because at the time there was no data, right? There still isn't very much good data to show that you mask a toddler, it's going to have any effect. So that caused outrage, and there was backlash following the COVID pandemic against mandatory vaccinations and masking. But there's a difference between the science and vaccinology and policy, right? So with policy, you have to communicate to the public that in times of uncertainty, decisions have to be made without all of the data available. Make sure that that is communicated because science takes time. Sometimes it takes multiple studies to show that vaccines are effective. I know the first COVID-19 vaccine studies were placebo-controlled, and in the height of a pandemic where you had so many thousands of people succumbing or getting sick, it was actually pretty easy to generate data fast because you had so many people affected. But with other vaccines, like smallpox today, you couldn't really do a clinical trial because it would be unethical, right? You can't give a placebo to someone who is exposed to smallpox versus someone who's potentially protected. So there's that dilemma that has to be dealt with. But I'm digressing. Sorry, that was just
No, that was perfect.
on smallpox.
Right. And because people did question it a lot during the COVID outbreak, how did we come up with this vaccine so quickly? And part of it was, as you had said, so many people were being affected. So many people were losing their lives, or, now we have so many patients with long COVID because of it. So there were more people with which to operate with, not operate's the wrong word. What you had just explained
Well,
was
you're
so
right.
many
So
people
with
were
regard
affected.
to generating the data that showed the vaccine was safe and efficacious, yes, absolutely. But the bigger reason, which is worth talking a little bit about, is there was a lot of suspicion. Well, this vaccine came out so fast. Well, actually, there was a huge amount of scientific research, NIH initiated, because of two previous coronavirus epidemics, very small ones. So there was
that we didn't
SARS,
hear much about
yeah,
in
SARS
I
outbreak
mean, we heard
occurred.
about it, but it wasn't a big deal.
Right, also in China, it came out, and then subsequently there was the MERS coronavirus, which occurred in the Middle East. Because of these earlier outbreaks, NIH scientists, structural biologists, they understood exactly from those outbreaks how these coronaviruses interact with your immune system or with your lung tissue, and they understood the mechanism. It was a specific receptor on your lungs called ACE2, and they developed models and approaches, vaccine strategies, so that when this new coronavirus came out, SARS-CoV-2, they were ready. They were ready. Not only that, but we had mRNA vaccine platforms that were also took many years to develop. And two University of Pennsylvania researchers, Drew Weissman and his colleague, they got the Nobel Prize last year because of the breakthroughs, the scientific breakthroughs in developing RNA platforms, which really is a genetic vaccine, which is very fast to manufacture, very simple, and very efficient in terms of getting into your immune system. We talked about the nanoparticles that are lipids with the RNA inside.
Right.
Very efficient in ways of making vaccines. So that contributed to the rapid speed with which the vaccines came to market or came out, as well as, the U.S. government was involved. Even Donald Trump promoted and tried to make sure that
Right.
people work together for the
Operation Warp Speed, right?
exactly. So we had Moderna, who were government funded. We had Pfizer that wasn't, who went their own way with BioNTech. And BioNTech actually, Pfizer had been, I was there at the time at Pfizer. BioNTech was working with Pfizer for flu vaccines for a number of years before the coronavirus came, the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus came. So all of these things contributed to being ready quickly. Which does make me worried that the mRNA vaccines have been, for reasons that are political, not from science, have been marginalized. And that's a shame because mRNA vaccine technologies are important for cancer therapies as well, and for future outbreaks. So the U.S. is behind in that the rest of the world is moving quickly with RNA vaccine platforms, whether it's GSK in Europe or Sanofi or the Chinese.
Yeah.
We're losing out because of our political ideologies at the top of HHS, I'm afraid.
And these were developed during the previous administration. And it's not like you had to, as you just explained, you didn't have to reinvent the wheel to create these technologies to create the COVID vaccine. It was already there. It had been there. I think people are also afraid when we call it a genetic material type
Right.
virus, or because, and look, science is hard. It was one of my toughest subjects in school, and I struggled. Now, what helped me was two of my children became scientists. One's biology, majored in biology, the other in chemistry, and I had to help them study sometimes when they were home on holiday breaks or whatever. And I was just interested because science is hard, but it can be really, really interesting. And also, I think I grew up during a time where there were more public health service messaging. We even got them in school, short films in school, although some of them were dreadfully done, but we got public health messaging that helped us understand things like diseases and vaccines. And, when we were in high school, it was about car accidents and, drunk driving and, things like that. I haven't really seen much of that, like in the last 10 or more years. I haven't seen much. And it really, all of this tough stuff is we're trying to wrestle with today. And we probably are going to go a little bit over time, Robert, but that's fine because this is a very important topic, as long as you have the time. Do you have
Oh,
the time for
I,
an extra 15? Okay, awesome. Giddy up, we're going to go. But then science is hard to understand, but it can be broken down. The basic principles of how our bodies work and how these things work are easier to understand And it's technology and things that you've been working with for years, because a lot of this stuff that created the COVID vaccine has been around for years. You didn't reinvent the wheel. Can you help our audience understand why they call it an mRNA vaccine or a genetic vaccine, and how that does tie into cancer treatments? Because I know relatives that have cancer are getting genetic type cancer treatments.
Yeah, so the RNA technology is based on the ability to deliver not the actual protein part of the bug, whether it's virus or bacterium, but the RNA is the genetic information that normally inside a cell gets converted to protein through a process called translation. Now, if you take the RNA and encapsulate it in a lipid and get it and inject it into your body, your immune cells will take up that lipid nanoparticle, and the RNA ends up already primed, ready to go. You know, your immune cell will convert that into a protein and present it to the rest of the immune system in a way that's very efficient. So it's genetic in the sense that the information is the vaccine, is part of the vaccine. But the RNA is very unstable. It doesn't last very long at all in your blood. It comes and it goes fast. Your immune cells take it up, and then they present the protein that they translate, and so there isn't a concern. You know, there's always the worry that, oh, the genetic vaccine is going to integrate into your DNA and cause genetic problems. That's actually not true at all. Even the DNA COVID SARS-CoV-2 vaccine that J&J and Oxford put together, you may remember there was one. It was distinct from the
Right.
mRNA, but it was a DNA vaccine that was delivered by a cold virus, an adenovirus. That was also a very successful vaccine, and the antigen, the part of the bug that's presented, is exactly the same construct that NIH designed. So the information it was the same, but the way it's delivered was a little different. So in one case it was a cold virus, in the other case it was a lipid nanoparticle with an RNA inside. By the way, the J&J vaccine had more side effects.
It
Very
did.
rare, very rare side effects, but a little bit more severe. So it was pulled off the market, whereas the mRNA vaccines are much simpler, easier to make, and have had not had a lot of safety issues. Of course, there are controversies over the fact that it was a small subpopulation, mostly healthy males who had mild endocarditis that was transient. Um, that is on the label. The number of cases per million vaccinated was small. I think 6 to 8, depending on which age group you look at. More so with the healthy teenagers, which generated an understandable controversy of whether or not you should bother to vaccinate healthy teens because they're not as susceptible, right? Um, and so the recommendation was not to give healthy adults the vaccine. But of course, if you have predispositions, if you have asthma, you're vulnerable to respiratory infections, then your doctor can make sure that you get the vaccine. Yeah.
And the myocarditis, just for our audience, is the swelling, like a swelling around the heart, right? Or swelling of the
Yes.
heart muscle, which
And
is
by Yeah, and by the way, if you got a COVID infection, you get pretty serious myocarditis. In fact,
right.
you know, if you get affected badly, it trashes your vascular system. You know, the COVID vaccine goes towards your endothelial tissue and your lung tissue, and in those that can't fight the infections, you can have very serious long-term consequences, long COVID, right? And that's true not just of COVID, but other viruses. You know, other viruses can cause long-term pathologies that immune dysregulation and immune dysfunction. So another reason why there's a risk benefit um, calculation to make whether a vaccine is going to be worth taking. And of course, most of the time, you know, most of us will go for a vaccine because we'd rather not suffer from the consequences of a devastating bacterial or viral illness, which is going to do a lot worse to you than a vaccine ever would. And by the way, vaccines are very, very tightly regulated. So we can have a separate webinar or conversation around vaccine
Right.
safety, how it's modeled, how it's monitored at different stages of clinical trials, from preclinical through phase 3, as well as post-licensing, and the mechanisms in place to report adverse events and so on and so forth. The regulations, as they should be, are very strict.
Right. And that is worthy of another episode, which I hope that I could have you back for, because it was actually when I had to take medication for my osteoporosis that I avoided medication for that for like 10 years. And it cost me in several broken bones, 6 in my spine, because my osteoporosis continued to worsen. What helped me was having a doctor, and I know a lot of us don't get this lucky, but I was lucky enough to get a doctor who not only explained how that medication I needed to take was going to work, he explained the side effects thoroughly, and he also took the time to explain the trials, the clinical trials, where one of the side effects being bone cancer, and he explained the clinical trial and how it was done and how much of the dosage was given to the mice in the study. Anyway, and we don't need our doctors to dive that deep with us on these topics, but I wish that there could be a way that they could address it and answer our questions, and and give us the materials or the resources to read the reliable, credible information, so that we can really understand a little bit more on a basic level how this stuff works. Because if we understand, and that was the key, I understood it better because of his explanation, and therefore my fear resolved, and I was able to use the medication. And I think
Yeah,
that's what happens with vaccines too.
well, there's lots of great information out there. I mean, the CDC website, yeah, there's some of the new administrators of the CDC have chosen to remove some information, but by and large, it's all there. But even more important than that, you'll notice that physicians whose job it is to protect us and inform on public health, they have associations that are committed to making their own recommendations. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Society of pediatricians, and these physician-oriented societies have in fact made their own recommendations to counter some of the more recent recommendations on, for example, the COVID accessibility of the COVID vaccine. So there are also amazing doctors out there, whether it's Paul Offit at the University of Pennsylvania or Peter Hotez from Baylor College, and other doctors who are doing Substack podcasts on all of these topics that the audience can listen into, and get informed so that they can make the best decisions for themselves and their families.
There are several on social media now too. Robert, there's a Dr. Rubin that I've been following. He's an allergist, immunologist, and he's on TikTok and Instagram. There's a Dr. Eric as well. He's been very vocal on Instagram, and a female urologist. She's absolutely fabulous. I should have had these names. I actually will list them in the description box below, because they're really worth following if you want someone, if you want to learn more about vaccines and learn more about how our bodies work. They do an absolutely wonderful job of public outreach on their social media. And they're hilarious too. Some of it is really funny.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of good information out there if you know where to look.
Yes, yes. And I think that's what ultimately we need, is we need the most reliable, up-to-date information. Vaccines have been around, as you said, since the smallpox vaccine. When did the polio vaccine come about?
The Salk vaccines, I believe in the 30s, there was the first one was a live oral vaccine on a sugar cube. And then subsequently an inactivated version, which was found to be a little bit safer. The original oral vaccine, because of quality control issues, there were a few cases of polio that were actually caused by the vaccine. Very rare, but it was had to do with the manufacturing. So to get away from that, the current polio vaccine is a killed virus vaccine, not quite as effective, but much safer, without any chance of the ability to cause disease.
And for people who are listening who don't remember what polio was or may not even have heard of it, because again, it feels like it was forever and so long ago. What was polio exactly, and what did it do? Why was it so devastating?
Yeah, polio was devastating because it basically caused paralysis in children, and in some cases permanent. And um, the vaccines did eventually come through in the 1950s, but outbreaks caused more than 15,000 cases of paralysis each year. Before then, 2 to 10% of children paralyzed died because the virus affected the muscles necessary to breathe. Um, and there are folks that
That's why
survived the
the iron
polio with
lung.
mild symptoms, but still weakness and paralysis. One of my aunts is an example, and then you'll remember Mitch McConnell, I think, is also a survivor of
Yes.
polio, and has partial lameness on one side, although he's done very well, obviously. But thanks to widespread vaccination, the United States has been essentially polio free, I believe, since 1979, according to my notes. Globally, the incidence of polio has decreased 99%, and wild polio virus is only circulates and is endemic to Afghanistan and Pakistan at this point in time.
Wow. And that's why, so it affected the muscles, particularly lung muscles. And that's why people
Hmm.
had to be put in an iron lung, which essentially breathed for them.
Yep, that's my understanding.
Yeah. So right. And FDR had polio as well, right?
Oh, right.
That's why he would always stand behind the podium, and he didn't want to be seen as weak, but his legs didn't work well. And that's why he had that swimming pool installed at the White House, because that was how he exercised, being that his legs were paralyzed. I don't know if the history books that I've read are correct. That's my son did a lot of reports on FDR when he was in school, and I remember learning about it then. I didn't know up until then. And I do know a few older people also who've been affected by polio, as you were mentioning, your aunt has been affected. And as they age, they said it gets harder because of the paralysis, even though, they were left with a milder form. As they're aging, it's getting harder and harder to walk. Some now need a wheelchair to help them get around. So again, it was a bad thing. It wasn't polio wasn't mild. Smallpox wasn't mild. Measles, mumps, rubella was not mild. It wasn't. And if enough people, I want to touch a little bit before we go on herd immunity. If enough people don't uh, get vaccinated, that's when herd immunity, this idea that we block it, like in large numbers of people aren't affected by the disease anymore, but that can break down when a lot of people don't get vaccinated. Is that how herd immunity works?
Yeah, so for vaccines that are very effective, such as measles, mumps, rubella, um, you reach a certain percentage of the population that are fully vaccinated. You get not everyone has to be, there's that 5% that don't get vaccinated, that are protected, and that can be important for those few folks that have religious objections, or more importantly, have extreme autoimmune issues, right?
Right.
But herd immunity doesn't work for all vaccines. So for COVID and for flu, these are vaccines that, while COVID vaccine is quite effective, the viruses are mutating and changing all the time. So, a seasonal vaccine for COVID for flu, you need to, modify the vaccine each year to make it effective for the next year's seasonal strain. Not so true of, measles is actually relatively conserved. It doesn't change that much, unlike flu and COVID. So that's why I think the measles live attenuated virus vaccine is so effective and continues to be effective. Same for mumps and rubella. So it depends on the pathogen. It depends on vaccine efficacy and how quickly the viruses or pathogens evolve and change. Bacterial pathogens tend not to change, although each bacterial pathogen that causes disease can have many different subspecies or different types that have different properties. But some viruses do change rapidly, like flu and COVID.
Right.
COVID.
Viruses seem to be very good at shape-shifting a lot so that
Yeah.
they can survive in other bodies, of course, in our bodies. So, and you mentioned too that severely immunocompromised people, I know some members of like the community that follow me on Instagram, for example, they have had negative reactions to vaccines. And, and these negative reactions, for the most part, I've seen reports, like even the Pfizer reports on the COVID vaccine, and they reported on, and Moderna did too, the myocarditis and other severe reactions, hives and anaphylaxis and all of that. So is that why some people have an adverse reaction to a vaccine? It's because of their immune system and it might be severely compromised?
It can. So you're talking about the adverse events to a vaccine
Yes.
that have to do more than just injection site, right? So with injection sites, you typically get redness, and you may get a mild fever. That that's that's normal and not serious. But you're talking about serious side effects that are concerning. I think the worst is so-called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which happens to a normal virus infection at very low frequency. But I think with the Johnson Johnson vaccine for COVID, for example, there were more cases of GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and so it got pulled off the market. So monitoring of vaccines is very important, and there is a mechanism in place to ensure vaccine safety. Um, and This was legislated during the Nixon time. And there's a reporting mechanism for any adverse event that you might have that's serious. You or your doctor is required actually to report side effects. And there's a database um, that um, I'm looking through my notes here. It's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, which is where you report vaccine adverse events. And the database is actually quite helpful because recently it was found that there's data there that shows that the newer shingles vaccine has way fewer side effects than the original, Merck's Zoster live attenuated vaccine. So it's useful there for both patients and for vaccine developers and regulators to monitor vaccine safety and look at how frequent you see these bad side effects, which are very rare. If it's not rare, it comes up quickly in a clinical trial. Phase 1 is the first of 3 phases of clinical trials where you're required to monitor safety. Phase 2 clinical trials where you start increasing the doses and looking at more patients. And then finally, the third clinical trial is where you look at sometimes tens of thousands of patients and keep looking at the frequency of side effects, and then you have to report them. They're on the label of the vaccines, and the CDC has this kind of information on the pathogens and the vaccines as well.
Yes, the VAERS reporting site. I'll put that link in the description box because that's very important. Even for a while, I don't think I've gotten these for a while with my last COVID booster, but in the very beginning, I would get check-ins from CVS that, they would they'd send me a text it's been 2 months since you got your COVID vaccine. And I just had to answer 4 or 5 simple questions in that, like a little survey. And it asked me, have you had COVID since getting the vaccine? Did you experience any adverse reactions to the vaccine? And it was like this little mini survey, and it was fast and it was easy, because that kind of gets into the part where I've mentioned, true confessions. I get my medications. I do not pull out the insert and read the whole thing. It's overwhelming. And same thing when you get your vaccines and, you get the couple of papers. I don't read all of that. And are there simpler ways? Like, I thought that was a really good idea to get that little text. I got it like 2 months out or 3 months out from getting the COVID vaccine, then 6 months out, 9 months out, and then like a year, and then it was time for my next booster. So are there ways that we could make it simpler, and patients also have to take a little responsibility on ourselves here too, to also provide them with that information, to let people know if we've had an adverse event, to let people know if we had COVID since getting the vaccine?
Well, as we discussed, the formal mechanism is through VAERS and
Reverse.
that database, but also, by talking to your doctor. Not all doctors, as you've probably found, are fully aware, right? So you may need to
Right.
go to the CDC website. Also, as I mentioned again, if you're pregnant and are worried about vaccines, look at the recommendation from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Look at
Yes.
the recommendations and information from the American Academy of Family Physicians, American Academy of Pediatrics, for those of us that are old, American Geriatric Society. That information and the recommendations are by professionals that understand the medical issues, but also the data, the epidemiology, the statistical significance of findings from clinical trials. They make recommendations based on evidence, based on data, and that's what we need we all need to inform the recommendations and decision making, which has been somewhat co-opted recently by current administration top officials. The CDC is still an amazing organization and does important work, but to get a different and independent recommendation and view, you can use these physician societies who have been posting recently over the controversies over the COVID vaccine, for example, or the Hep B vaccine. Should you get Hep B for your infant, and why are they pulling it off,
Yeah.
or recommending? So this is a constantly changing situation with West Coast, East Coast liberal states taking charge themselves and making their own recommendations, again, based on
Yes.
physicians' recommendations, so that we don't have to go to Canada to get our vaccines.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's the thing. Like I said, science, I think a lot of people are intimidated by science. I certainly was. I got less intimidated when my children majored in it. And I guess I'm lucky that I'm able to ask my doctors questions, and I have doctors who will answer those questions, and to talk to people like you. I mean, I'm very lucky that I get to talk to someone like yourself, that you, Robert, through this whole episode, you've helped me understand a lot more about viruses, bacteria, how long, they've been around, and how our immune systems work, and how vaccines had to come into play, because, a lot of people were dying. A lot of people were left with issues. And, I wasn't left with serious issues. I mean, in a way I was. That chicken pox that I had when I was pregnant caused what is it, those antibodies that are for mono, really, Epstein
Epstein-Barr
Barr.
virus. Epstein,
Yes,
yeah.
caused those antibodies in me to skyrocket. And it was right after that pregnancy, actually, not shortly after, I started to have these health issues, and then eventually being diagnosed with Crohn's, Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, autoimmune thyroid disease, and all of that stuff sort of came after. And so, and my father too, I think you and I had discussed via email, like, about our family background history. My father had what they called scarlet fever when he was 4, and he was born in 1918. He almost died, and it left him with lifelong heart problems.
Yeah, my mother too. She during the Second World War as a child got a rheumatic fever, which is Group A strep, which is what kids get as pharyngitis when they're young, but can also become quite serious when it spreads and causes damage to your heart. So there is no vaccine, unfortunately, yet for Group A strep. However, if diagnosed with rapid tests, which are available in Western world anyway, you can treat very readily with antibiotics. The bug is very susceptible to simple amoxicillin, which you may remember giving to your children when
Oh
they
yeah,
had strep throat.
the pink stuff, the pink
Yeah.
liquidy stuff that they didn't mind because it tasted good. Robert, we need, as your time allows, of course, in the future, I'd love to have you back on to talk about clinical trials and how they're designed and, what scientists learned from them. And also, to talk about antibiotics, because as you and I both know, AMR, antimicrobial resistance, is becoming a big problem. And we need new antibiotics developed and on the market. And, we could do a whole episode on that too, and how antibiotics themselves work,
Yeah.
and, how we should use antibiotics properly and be good stewards of, antibiotic use. Lots of great topics here. My audience, I know this is a very difficult subject matter, but again, we tried to boil it down so that, hopefully to foster a better understanding of why vaccines were invented in the first place and what diseases they wiped out or nearly wiped out, and how they can help us moving forward to be a healthier society, to be a society that, um, knows about these issues and knows how these things work so that we can make educated, informed decisions moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I would just end with an urgent request that the listeners, yeah, stay informed by listening to, as we talked about today, the many unbiased experts communicating effectively out there, and to vote at every opportunity for candidates who are committed to protecting our health through science, sound science, and evidence-based public health policies. So we need to fight and make sure that information is disseminated to those of us that need it to make decisions for our families and friends.
Yes, it's really teamwork, guys. Our healthcare is based upon us, the patient, working with our doctors and helping to support, people like here. Robert, of course, is retired from being a vaccinologist, but once a vaccinologist, always a vaccinologist, and by supporting our scientists and supporting science. And so basically that's what we're all about here, guys. And there's going to be a lot of links below in the description box. Check them out at your leisure. Robert, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you,
And
Jackie.
it was
Real
a great
privilege.
conversation.
Mhm.
All right. Thank you. And we'll see you guys. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of the 120 Pod.